creepy freelancer horror stories. Natalie loved freelancing. She loved the independence it gave her, the freedom to work when and where she pleased. Her little apartment was her sanctuary, her coffee mug her constant companion. But lately, her sanctuary felt more like a cage. Her inbox was a wasteland, the bills piled high on her desk like a silent threat. Anxiety crept in, wrapping its cold fingers around her every thought. Then, on a rainy evening, something changed. An email arrived. The subject line stood out like a beacon in the dark. Urgent. Creative writer needed. High pay. Natalie's eyes widened. Her heart raced as she clicked it open. The message was brief. We're seeking a skilled writer for a confidential project. Discretion and quick turnaround required. Pay is generous. Respond immediately for details. She hesitated. The sender's email address was vague, generic almost. It lacked the credibility she usually looked for. But desperation has a way of dulling your instincts. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, almost against her better judgment, she typed, "I'm interested. Please send details." The reply came almost instantly. It was unnerving how quickly it arrived. Inside was a contract, simple, straightforward, and the first assignment. It seemed easy, almost too easy. The task? Write short, atmospheric narratives based on prompts. The pay wasn't just generous, it was astonishing. Half the payment had already been transferred to her account. Just like that. Natalie's heart thudded. She could feel the little voice in the back of her head whispering, warning her, but she ignored it. She needed this. The first prompt landed in her inbox minutes later. Write about someone trapped in their home, hearing whispers that grow louder with each passing hour. Her pulse quickened. It was strange, sure, but nothing she couldn't handle. Horror was her specialty. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, wrapped herself in her favorite sweater, and dove in. The rain outside drummed softly against the windows. At first, it was a soothing backdrop, but as she wrote, the rhythm of the rain changed. It wasn't random anymore. It sounded like tapping. Natalie paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She glanced at the window. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something move. A blur, a flicker in the reflection. Her breath caught. She stared harder, but there was nothing. She shook her head, laughing nervously. "Too much coffee," she muttered, turning back to her laptop. She finished the story, hit send, and leaned back in her chair. Relief washed over her. Brief, fleeting relief. The response came immediately. "Excellent work. Next prompt incoming." Another payment, double the first. Her chest tightened. This wasn't normal. None of it was normal. The second prompt was even stranger. Describe a writer who begins hearing the voices of her characters. They demand a new ending to their story. Natalie let out a shaky laugh. The prompt felt too close to home, too specific. But she brushed the thought aside. She started writing again. As the words flowed, the quiet hum of her apartment shifted. The refrigerator's usual buzz grew louder, deeper, almost like a growl. The shadows in the room thickened, pooling in the corners like ink. Natalie stopped, her hands trembling slightly. Her apartment suddenly felt wrong. That's when she heard it. A whisper. Faint, indistinct, but there. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper grew clearer, the words creeping into her consciousness like tendrils of smoke. "You shouldn't have taken this job." Her heart slammed against her ribs. She spun around, her chair creaking in protest. The room was empty, silent. She forced a laugh. "Just my imagination," she whispered to herself, but her voice sounded hollow, brittle. She finished the second story and sent it off. The reply came just as fast as before. This time, it wasn't just praise. "You've been chosen for a very special project. Proceed carefully." Her fingers trembled as she read the next prompt. Write about a freelancer who begins noticing the events in her stories manifesting in her reality. Natalie's breath hitched. The rain, the whispers, the shadows. Her hands grew clammy, but she pushed the fear down. She couldn't stop now. The money was too good. She told herself it was just a coincidence. She opened a new document and began typing. But this time, as she wrote, the line between fiction and reality blurred even further. The tapping on the window returned, louder now, more deliberate. The whispers grew bolder, circling her, closing in. Finish it. Her heart pounded in her ears. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see something. Someone. But the glass reflected only her pale, wide-eyed face. Finish it. The lights flickered. The whispers became a chant. Finish it. Finish it. Her hands moved on their own, typing feverishly. She was no longer in control. The words spilled onto the page, chaotic, frantic. When she finally typed the last sentence, the apartment fell silent. Completely, utterly silent. She exhaled shakily, leaning back in her chair. Relief surged through her until her phone buzzed. The subject line of the email read, "Final instructions." Inside, the message was short. "Write your ending." Her blood turned to ice. She glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m., 15 minutes to midnight. The whispers returned. This time they weren't faint. They were loud, clear, and they were coming from her laptop. Write it. Write your ending. She wanted to stop. She wanted to run. But her hands moved against her will. The story poured out of her faster and faster. Her vision blurred as she typed the final words. When she hit the last keystroke, the power cut out. The apartment plunged into darkness. Then came the knock. Soft at first. It grew louder, more insistent. Natalie's chest tightened. Her phone buzzed one last time. The email read, "Thank you for completing the project. Payment has been processed." A new deposit. More money than she'd ever seen in her life. The knock turned into pounding. A voice called out, low and guttural. "Natalie, it's time." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from behind her. This is Very Scary Freelancer Horror Story number 2. The coffee shop was alive with its usual chaos, a low hum of voices, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional clatter of cups. But for Talia, all of it was just background noise. She sat hunched over her laptop in her usual corner, the soft glow of the screen reflecting her growing frustration. Work had been painfully slow. Bills were piling up, and her bank account was on life support. The stress weighed heavy like a constant, crushing presence. She refreshed her email inbox again, silently pleading for something, anything, that could pull her out of this rut. And then, a new email appeared. Artemis Creations, seeking a talented designer for a unique logo project. High pay, quick turnaround. Interested? Talia's heart skipped a beat. She clicked it open, her eyes scanning the brief message. The logo must embody timelessness, power, and legacy. Deadline 3 days. It was vague, too vague. But then again, so was her fridge, her wallet, and her prospects. Her hesitation warred with desperation. She typed a cautious reply. "I'm interested. Could you provide more details about the project?" The response came almost instantly. "Details will come in stages. Trust your creativity. Payment will follow upon completion. Accept?" A chill ran down her spine. There was something unsettling about the precision of the reply, almost mechanical. But $5,000? For one logo? That kind of money could fix everything. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. This felt wrong, off in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Yet the weight of her rent notice pushed her forward. "I accept," she typed, hitting send before doubt could claw its way back. The first instructions arrived that evening. Begin with a circle. It represents eternity. Simple enough, she thought. She began sketching on her tablet, the lines flowing naturally. Yet, as she worked, the air in her apartment grew heavier. It wasn't just her imagination, was it? The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. An hour later, her laptop chimed. Incorporate a crescent moon. It symbolizes transformation. Talia's fingers froze above the stylus. She hadn't shared her progress with anyone. How did they know she was ready for the next step? Her stomach tightened, but she shook it off. Eccentric clients weren't exactly new to her line of work. She added the crescent moon to the design, her hand steady despite the growing unease. By 2:47 a.m., she was struggling to keep her eyes open. The room was unnervingly silent, save for the occasional creak of her old apartment. At 3 a.m. sharp, another email arrived. Include an Ouroboros, a serpent consuming itself. It represents renewal. Attached was an image of the serpent. Talia opened it and recoiled. The detail was so vivid it felt alive. She could see the texture of the scales, the sharpness of its fangs, and, most unsettlingly, the eyes. They seemed to lock onto hers through the screen. Her heart pounded. The room felt colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. She rubbed her arms, glancing nervously at the darkened corners of the room. "It's just a job," she whispered to herself. "Just a logo." But her voice sounded small, fragile. The next morning, Talia woke to find another email waiting for her. "Impressive progress, final step, sign the contract." She clicked the attachment. Instead of a standard legal document, it was strange. The language was cryptic, almost poetic. "This logo is a threshold. By creating it, you grant passage." She frowned. Passage? What did that mean? Her instincts screamed at her to walk away, to delete the email and pretend none of this ever happened. But the contract also promised her payment she desperately needed. Her hands trembled as she signed the document. That night, Talia dreamed of a vast, endless field under a black sky. There were no stars, no moon, just an oppressive void. In the distance stood a figure, tall and shadowed, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The figure didn't speak, but its presence pressed down on her, suffocating. She woke, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. Her heart raced as her phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Complete the logo. The doorway is ready." Talia stared at the message, dread pooling in her stomach. She wanted to quit, to delete everything and walk away. But something deep inside wouldn't let her. She began to work, each stroke of her stylus feeling less like her own and more like it was being guided by an unseen force. The shadows in her apartment seemed alive, stretching and twisting, whispering things she couldn't understand. When she finished, she stared at the logo. It was unlike anything she'd ever created. Haunting, intricate, almost alive. Her laptop screen flickered, and for a brief moment she saw her reflection. But the eyes staring back weren't hers. Her phone buzzed again. "Excellent work. Payment has been sent." Talia checked her account, and sure enough, $5,000 had been deposited. Relief flickered through her, briefly. Then came the knock. It was soft at first. Tap, tap. Her stomach turned. It wasn't a polite knock. It was deliberate, calculated. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. Silence. The knock came again, louder this time. Tap, tap. Summoning what little courage she had, Talia crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. Her phone buzzed once more. She glanced at the screen, her hands trembling. Welcome them. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the phone, the sound echoing in the silent room. Over the following days, Talia's world descended into chaos. The logo she'd created began appearing everywhere, on posters, graffiti, even as faint etchings on walls she passed. The whispers in her apartment grew louder, more insistent. And the shadows. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures, tall and impossibly thin, their glowing eyes watching her from every corner. Talia stopped sleeping. She stopped eating. She tried to reach out to Artemis Creations, but every email bounced back. The payment disappeared from her account, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Her reflection in the mirror began to shift. It followed her movements, but its eyes, those glowing eyes, lingered just a little too long. One night the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Her lights flickered violently before plunging her apartment into complete darkness. And then, they came. Figures emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes burning into her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The last thing she saw was her laptop screen, glowing faintly with the logo she had designed. When her landlord entered days later, after neighbors reported strange noises, the apartment was empty. All that remained was her laptop, the logo still displayed on the screen. And somewhere far beyond what Talia could understand, the doorway she had created stood open. This is most disturbing freelancer horror story number 3. Freelancing was supposed to be her escape. After a soul-crushing corporate job, Alyssa embraced the freedom to design her own life, away from the deadlines, the grueling hours, and the office politics. Freelancing allowed her to create, to breathe, to feel like she was in control. But there were things no one told her about this path. The late nights that blurred into mornings, the isolation, and the occasional job that made her question the price she paid for freedom. One late Friday night, Alyssa was hunched over her desk, bathed in the soft, dull glow of her laptop. The hum of traffic outside barely registered in her mind as she scrolled through emails. It had been a slow week. Her inbox was mostly filled with junk, unread messages from clients who had either ghosted her or never paid. Just as she was about to close it, one subject line caught her eye. Subject: Urgent Project Inquiry. She clicked it immediately. The email was brief, almost too simple. Dear Alyssa, I need your design expertise for an urgent project. It's a simple task, but I'm willing to pay generously for your time. The deadline is tomorrow morning. Please respond if interested. Regards, Isaac Grayson. Generous pay? Alyssa couldn't help but be intrigued. The offer was too good to pass up. She quickly sent a response, asking for more details. The reply came within moments, almost as if Isaac had been waiting. I need a business card designed for Grayson Enterprises. The card should feature a circular logo with specific symbols around its edge. I've attached a reference sketch for guidance. Alyssa opened the attachment, her stomach doing a little flip. The sketch was unsettling. Strange symbols that seemed to twist and intertwine, their meaning unclear. At first glance, they looked almost ancient, as if they were pulled from a forgotten time. The designs were intricate and precise, each curve and line deliberate. She hesitated. Something about the drawing made her uneasy, but she dismissed it. A job was a job, right? She needed the money. Stop overthinking, she muttered to herself, shaking off the uneasy feeling. Alyssa dove in, the click of her mouse the only sound breaking the silence. She traced over the sketch, refining the edges, making sure each symbol was exactly as it was on the paper. The process was tedious, but nothing she couldn't handle. But as she worked, something began to shift. Her focus was sharp, yet the room seemed to grow colder, quieter. The shadows in the corners of her apartment seemed darker, heavier. And there, just for a second, a whisper, too soft to make out. She paused, trying to shake it off. Just tired. It's late, she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. She forced herself to continue, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. By the time the design was complete, her fingers felt stiff. She sent the file to Isaac with her invoice, hoping to be done with it, but Isaac's response came almost immediately. Perfect. There is one last task. Print the card and deliver it to the address below. Alyssa stared at the screen. Printing and delivering? That wasn't part of the deal. She could feel the unease creeping back. Something felt wrong. But the promise of generous pay tugged at her. Her hesitation was short-lived. It's just a drop-off. What could go wrong? She said, her voice a little too loud in the empty room. The drive was long, the road stretching out ahead, bathed in the dim glow of her headlights. As she approached the address, a chill ran down her spine. The street was eerily quiet, the houses dark, their windows like empty eyes staring into the night. The house she pulled up to was massive, old, an imposing Victorian structure that loomed over her. The windows were blacked out, except for a single flickering light in the upstairs room. She hesitated. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, heart pounding. But she had come this far. "Just drop it off and leave," she whispered, trying to calm her nerves. The door creaked open before she could even knock. No one greeted her. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust, and the old floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The entryway stretched out in front of her, dark and oppressive. A grand staircase rose up ahead, disappearing into shadow. To the left, a faint light flickered. A small table near the door had a folded note on it. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the paper as though it were alive. "Leave the envelope in the study." Alyssa didn't question it. She just did what she was told, her heart beating faster with every step she took. The study was at the far end of the hall. She pushed open the door, and as she stepped inside, her eyes were immediately drawn to a framed carving on the wall. Her breath hitched. It was a perfect replica of the symbol she had just designed. Not just a copy. It was the same, etched into the wood with disturbing precision. The edges were smooth, worn down with time. Alyssa's stomach churned. She turned to leave, but her legs felt like stone, unable to move. The air felt thicker now, oppressive. The shadows seemed to grow, curling and twisting at the edges of her vision. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, barely audible. But they were there, and they were growing louder. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Her breath was shallow, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. She turned quickly, but the room was empty. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice cracking in panic. The whispering grew into a cacophony all around her, coming from every direction. Shapes moved in the corner of her eyes, but when she looked, they were gone. The lamp on the desk flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. And then the symbols on the wall began to glow, a sickly green light. The air became cold, biting. Alyssa's breath came in shallow gasps, her skin prickling as if something was standing right behind her. And then everything stopped. The light flickered back to normal. The room returned to its quiet stillness. The whispers faded away. Alyssa rushed to the door, hands shaking as she fumbled for the handle. It opened. She didn't wait to see who or what might be behind her. She ran. She ran through the house, through the hall, past the staircases, her legs barely carrying her as she burst out into the cold night air. She didn't stop until she was in her car, speeding away as fast as her hands could grip the steering wheel. The drive back home was a blur. Her hands trembled as she locked all the doors and windows in her apartment. It felt like someone was still watching her, waiting. She tried to sleep. She tried to forget. But the silence in her room felt suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper, closer. She could still hear the whispers, haunting her, just beyond the edge of her consciousness. Her phone buzzed. Her heart skipped a beat as she checked the notification. Another email. "Thank you for your service. The contract is fulfilled." Her blood ran cold. "We may call upon your talents again in the future." She didn't know what Isaac Grayson wanted or what he truly was. All she knew was that she could never, ever do another job for him. The haunting whispers were still there, lingering, just beyond the edges of her mind. And Alyssa knew, deep down, that the contract hadn't ended. It was only just beginning.